Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to this presentation and for the kind introduction. I am very delighted to participate in the Dialogos Philosophicos, and I'd say let's begin right away, shall we? The title of my talk is Are Algorithms Concepts? Reflecting on AI with Hegelian Logic. This encompasses several aspects that shape the structure of the presentation. I will start with the end of the subtitle. Recently, the opportunities and challenges of artificial intelligence have transcended the mere academic sphere and entered the mainstream. Therefore, it is all the more necessary to approach it with calm reflection and to avoid falling into extreme positions. However, one thing is certain. We cannot engage in issues of artificial intelligence without drawing from philosophy. AI is neither merely a technological phenomenon, nor can it be limited to individual scientific fields. It also compels us to engage with it and position ourselves in relation to it, that is, in philosophical terms, of course. For instance, artificial intelligence raises questions about the ontology of knowledge, of consciousness, moral philosophical questions, or about the dimensions of our existential self-understanding as supposedly rational beings. Hence, if we consider AI as a philosophical phenomenon, the next question is how to handle it from a philosophical standpoint. Of course, there are various strategies, and it would require a whole seminar to list all the possible different approaches. However, I have chosen an approach to AI that I find extremely fruitful and yet underrepresented in contemporary philosophy, especially in the philosophy of AI. And this approach is transcendental and speculative logic. This very philosophical mode of thinking, established by Immanuel Kant and his successors, has important implications for AI. For transcendental and speculative logic seeks to clarify how knowledge, information, or in modern terms, data is possible at all, what meaning it holds, and to what extent the structure of our cognition, of course, conditions the emergence of data reality. Thus, current issues related to AI, to virtual reality, or even to cybernetics and stuff like that should also be approached from the perspective of transcendental and speculative philosophy. And in today's talk, I will primarily explore this issue through one of its most complex and influential proponents, namely through Hegel. Now, there are various and numerous ways to close in on AI that could be chosen from Hegel's perspective. I have opted for a highly abstract and complex one, which stemmed from his key work, the so-called Science of Logic. In this work, Hegel examines the extent to which it is possible for us to comprehend reality as fully grounded in a logic that we, in turn, can also realize. This approach is also known in philosophy as absolute idealism. Now, Hegel's term idealism initially has no political or psychological meaning. It means that reality is shaped in such a way that it can comprehend and systematically represent itself. In other words, reality is itself a concept that is in turn realized through the very process of its own conceptualization. And, according to Hegel, this process can even be depicted logically and systematically. And this, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the main title of my talk. If we claim that reality can be systematically comprehended and represented due to its inherently conceptual structure, what then does the term concept even mean? And based on this, the question arises, does the logic of the concept, as Hegel understands it, correspond to the underlying logical structure of AI, which is commonly found in the form of so-called algorithms? In other words, the question is, are algorithms concepts in Hegel's sense? If they are, good for both us and AI. If they are not, then what are algorithms? And what philosophical challenges do arise from them? Ladies and gentlemen, such questions set the stage for my following elaborations, which will be divided into the following 3 sections. First, what is the concept according to Hegel? Second, what are algorithms? And third, how can we understand their mutual connection from a Hegelian viewpoint? So let's start right away. What is the concept according to Hegel? An expert usually responds to this question by saying that it is not easy to explain and requires a lengthy and complex trail of thought. For before directly addressing the logic of something called concept in the science of logic, Hegel establishes the logic of being and the logic of essence as its precursors. He is known, therefore, as a thinker of a very complex development where each aspect needs to be meticulously derived from the other. Therefore, it seems almost impossible to provide a concise and short outline of any topic in his thought. Now, on the one hand, this is entirely correct. On the other hand, however, the logic of the concept explicitly allows us to start right away, to freshly start even from it. For what Hegel understands by the concept introduces an entirely new element to the previously stringent, deductive and necessitated logical development in the doctrine of being and the doctrine of essence, where one aspect is derived constantly from the other. And this new element that is added by the logic of concept is freedom. Thinking as concept, or as soon as it becomes concept and therefore becomes thinking itself. This thinking attains the ability to establish itself through its own freedom, as Hegel puts it. Now, this happens by logically including a fundamental act of negation that also encompasses the negation of everything that came before the concept. So of the whole logic of being and the logic of essence. They are negated by including their negation and therefore becoming concept. By this, so Hegel, the whole logic becomes its own subject. Which is why Hegel also refers to the logic of the concept, the third part of the science of logic, as subjective logic. In other words, by the concept, reality manifests itself as capable of being a subject for and through itself. I repeat that. A concept, or the concept, is reality manifesting itself as being capable of becoming its own subject for and through itself. The concept is the logic of selfhood, so to say, by including radical negation within itself. This is why, according to Hegel, a self can only be a self if it is not simply derived from something else, if it does not simply stem from something else, but rather executes and establishes itself by its very own means, that is, by its very own logic. Therefore, the logic of the concept is the logic of selfhood, and the logic of freedom. The only thing derived within the logic of concept is its own underivability. Concept or the concept is not a consequence of something else. It is entirely a non sequitur. It does simply not follow. And the ability to not follow is its very own logic. It is the logical capability to not follow at all. Only a subject realizes itself as a subject by not following from anything else. It is ultimately an act of a self-establishing freedom that takes place within the concept as a logically comprehensible form. So the concept is the logical grasping of the act of subjective freedom. According to Hegel, we have to say by all this that we do not have concepts. You can think of symbols, words, or terms, or signs, if you like. So we do not have concept in these kinds of forms. We are concepts, namely as acts of selfhood. A self cannot simply be causally or deductively derived from anything else. It involves a different kind of logic, namely a logic of inclusive negation, that is its own inclusive negation, which Hegel thoroughly examines over several hundred pages in the third part of the Science of Logic, namely the doctrine of the concept. In other words, Hegel investigates how freedom logically enables and actualizes itself by itself for itself. It must develop its own conceptual system by this, through which it logically demonstrates the originality of its own non sequitur act that leads to its own establishment. So by establishing and demonstrating its own system, it initially establishes the very non sequitur act that leads to it. So that's the term that's meant by the term the logic of selfhood. It's a logic of self-reference, of acting and performative self-reference, and therefore self-positioning, of course. Now, this development consists in, how does it look like? So let's ask how does it look like? This development consists in a deepening conceptual apprehension and depiction of the logic of subjectivity. We apprehend and depict by enriching the concept what it means to be a subject. The concept exists as a thinking subject, inasmuch as it explicates itself by deepening its own logic through its own logic until it reaches a point where it performs its own act from within itself. Through this deepening, it explicates itself in increasingly richer logical forms that do not just transition from one to another as it does in the logic of being and essence, but rather gradually enrich themselves with their ability to include their own negation and their own non sequitur, so their own capability to not follow from something else anymore. And in the course of the third part of the Science of Logic, as established by Hegel, the concept deepens itself from a logic of mere formal structures to a logic even of knowledge, of purposiveness, vitality, and ultimately, that's the end of its course, to an acting personality in which freedom finds its own selfhood. So it peaks within personality, within subjective personality. Hegel calls this richest stage of the concept the absolute idea. Thus, the concept and concepts are not terms or symbols, but a specific action through which reality establishes, posits, and demonstrates itself as being capable of being a subject. By this, it also shows that it has always already been its own subject in order to be able to achieve its own subjectivity. So its own subjectivity is the very own precondition of establishing its own subjectivity. In other words, it reveals how and in what way it has always logically referred to itself, and therefore always been able to evaluate itself logically, even in its states where it was not a subject initially. So just to be clear, this of course is no subjectivism in psychological terms, for it also applies to every supposed object in reality. Let's emphasize this a bit. For in the form of manifold individual concepts, reality establishes itself as objects that are continuously capable of subjectivity by virtue of the concept being more or less realized in them. Hegel calls this conceptual objectivity. Objects show that the objective is always already capable of becoming subject when brought to different concepts. In this process, the concept, vice versa, ongoingly deepens itself. So let me repeat that. Objects are not counterparts of the subject or of concepts. They are concepts not yet or not anymore being a concept. That is inclusive negation. They are concepts that fully include their own negation and therefore are subjects not yet or not anymore being objects, being subjects, and therefore they are objects. Objects that are not yet subjects or not anymore subjects. Subject and object are not opposed to each other, but are a mutually enriching unity for Hegel. Hegel therefore refers to this unity as the idea, that is the already mentioned richest form of reality as self-conceptualization. In it, the objective side of reality manifests itself, as I said before, as the concept that includes its own negation by being not yet or no longer itself. Not yet itself would be the logic of being and the logic of essence. No longer itself would be the logic of objectivity and of the idea. And therefore is not the very subject it actually is. It, the subject, then establishes itself in other forms, such as, for example, automatic mechanisms, chemisms, lawful processes of nature or of society, or purposeful events of acting individuals. So according to Hegel, all sciences, as well as the arts, religion, law, or even technology, work on this basis of inclusive negation within subjects. They are, so to speak, a freedom that repeatedly has not yet fully become itself, but at the same time already exists in a more or less established approach to itself. Now Hegel develops these illuminating logical approaches in the different parts of his philosophical system, and you can read it there. For us, it is important that in sum, the concept is already present in all reality in different grades and modes. Now, according to Hegel, such different modes are in fact even very necessary, because if the concept is truly the realization of freedom, then it must be able to exist even without being itself. That is, as its own negation, as I have already expressed it. For otherwise, it would not be free, the subject would not be free, but dependent on one last logical form, namely itself. The subject would be dependent on itself, if it would not be able to even transcend itself by including its own negative logic. That is why Hegel shows to what extent the subject, now as an object, can even exist without being itself and present itself in numerous logical forms, such as, for example, cause and effect, matter and form, ground and grounded, and so on. They are all early forms, if you like. They are all early forms of subjectivity. So cause and effect is an early form of freedom, so to say. A very highly established early form, of course. There are earlier forms, so to say. So not even less enriched forms of the logic of subjectivity, so to say. So they are all a subjectivity without being itself. Now, based on this, the general conceptual realization of subjectivity can be observed and evaluated to varying degrees in all individual and differentiated concepts of reality. And on this ground, our question arises. How should we classify artificial intelligence and in this context? What is the reality of artificial intelligence if we grasp it through the Hegelian logic of concepts being able to be themselves or without themselves to various degrees? To achieve this, we start with the algorithmic logic of artificial intelligence. So now we ask, what are algorithms? Well, algorithms are, in the most general sense, process instructions in which a given task is to be completed in a finite number of derivative steps. So algorithms operate on the basis of logical consequence. One thing leads to the next. Their mechanisms do not involve a conceptual non sequitur, as the subject does within Hegel. Algorithms are governed by logical consistency even, which of course may reach the highest, almost overwhelming complexity, but always remains consistent, deductive and derivative, and what's most important, non-contradictory. Thus, the difference between computation and conceptual thinking does not lie in their respective complexity, so as you would say, well, thinking is a more complex version of computation, or vice versa, computation is a more complex or faster version of thinking, or the like. Their difference is an ontological one, namely an ontological one regarding their respective capability of the inclusion of their own negation. Thinking can do that, it can negate itself. Computation cannot negate itself in an ontological way, in terms of its own being. Now, if algorithms therefore are not concepts in the Hegelian sense, how can they nevertheless be understood according to Hegel's science of logic? For they must be logical comprehensible if we want to attain a concept of them. They are, of course, also forms of modes, degrees of concept, but which ones is the important question. To address this, let us consider the foundations of how AI currently works. I say currently because its development will, of course, continue in technological terms, which I will discuss at the end of my presentation. So, from a current perspective, we can point out the following fundamental function of artificial intelligence. AI is a deductive quantifier. Now, what does that mean? It means that AI operates based on algorithmic command chains that follow mathematical quantitative criteria. Let's first consider this on a technical level. So, simplistically speaking, AI is based on transistor circuits that provide the foundation of artificial intelligence through their ability to minimize or amplify the flow of the electric current. That is what a transistor does. It minimizes or amplifies the flow of the electric current. Now, those transistors are then connected in circuits according to consistent deductive forms, such as if-then operations, and operations, or relations, not relations, and or not relations, and so on, to trial-error operations, pattern repetition techniques, or conditioning mechanics. So that all seems familiar, of course. It's the forms of formal logic, so not the transcendental and speculative logic that I am talking about from a Hegelian perspective. AI is restricted to the laws of formal abstract logic, or you could say the logic of understanding with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. But I do not want to emphasize that. We stay in the science of logic. So, transistor circuits and their complex combinations, they are even called neurons in artificial intelligence, involve a logic of deduction within a given ontology of derivative consequentialism. And AI operates on such a consequentialism. One thing logically leads to the next through patterns of formal and abstract logic, of symbolic logic, and the transistor circuits are interconnected by the laws of formal logic. That's AI's consequentialism. Now, let's add the aspect of quantification to this ontology of consequentialism and algorithmic deduction. Currently, AIs are mostly based on a logic of so-called weights and activation functions. I will highlight that in a moment. For these designations, namely weights and activation functions, are very evocative for their purpose. What do they mean? An algorithmically designed transistor circuit does not simply forward the electric current arbitrarily or by chance, but it follows mathematical guidelines. The aforementioned digital neurons, so the complex interconnections of transistors, are interconnected in various mathematical ways. And this allows for different current strengths to be incorporated into the forwarding structure of multiple transistor patterns. And the forwarding structure is, of course, the forwarding structure of the electric current flow. And these multiple gradually regulated current flows of electric signals are called weights. Now, how does a weight function? It functions like this. Only when a specific signal strength is reached by the input from different other neurons, an electric current flow to the next neuron is initiated. So you see, we try to imitate the biological functions of the human brain in AI. That is why this structure of weights is guided by so-called algorithmic activation functions, just like brain neurons. For instance, they are mathematized by exponential functions that combine repeated input into weights and the like. So that is very complex, and I will not emphasize that because we have no time for this, but you can search it on your own, of course. For us, it's important that thus we see that mathematical and deductive quantification of the electric current determines which signal is forwarded and processed into an output. The calculation of such weights by mathematical laws is then based on numerous other algorithms, all of which aim to ensure what? To ensure a statistical approximation of the desired output. So, inputs and outputs of artificial intelligence are treated as statistically guided quantification of current flows, of electric current flows, which are to be approximated to a desired result. In other words, the function of the weights is continuously adjusted by repeating the same algorithms and of course engaging in new ones. Such algorithms thus serve the automation of the processes within the transistor circuits. Of course, this is all a very simplified explanation, but I think you get the point. So, what follows from this? We see that the dynamics of artificial intelligence are based on quantitative statistical approximation processes, which are mirrored by the regulation of the electric current flows. Now, the same principle applies to the information then that is processed in AI on a virtual level. AI is trained algorithmically on flows of data inputs and calculates further patterns based on those flows. The flow is, in its logic, both deductive, derivative, and oriented on the statistically analyzed quantities of input data. Or in simpler terms, you can say in AI, what occurs more frequently, what is repeated more often, or what is more likely statistically tends to contribute to the corresponding output of information. This is the virtual mirror of weights in transistor circuits. So we see data is primarily treated as quanta, meaning that quantity, frequency, and statistical approximation values determine the quality of the data being used in AI and being outputted in AI or by AI. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of Hegelian logic, we can ask this: in which mode of reality or in which ontology do we find ourselves with all this, with the quantification of information? For, as we've seen, an algorithm lacks both the non sequitur and the affirmative inclusion of its own negation, and thus its orientation towards what Hegel calls the idea. So algorithms are not concepts. AI does not establish concepts in the Hegelian sense. Instead, AI is currently situated at another stage read with the science of logic, namely in the logic and doctrine of being. This late stage of being is called measure, and it belongs to the most challenging parts of the science of logic. Now, in the logic of measure, Hegel demonstrates the extent to which qualitative and quantitative forms of being merge into one another and are resolved into each other. Thus, being gains its qualitative determination, you could say its what, through different quantitative structures, that is, its amount or its how much. Quality is determined by an abstract how much of being, of any being, of course. That is to say, different quantities of being determine what being itself is. Certain quanta each yield a specific quality of being. From Hegel's perspective, this then gives rise even to stuff like the idea of a complete mathematics of nature, which is also the foundation of artificial intelligence, of course. However, AI adds also information and not only natural objects to this mix. For information is also meant to be traced back to a quantified quality in artificial intelligence. AI manifests information, knowledge, and concepts as mathematizable relations of quantities. And this, of course, as we've just seen, aligns precisely with the status of measure in Hegel's logic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, according to Hegel, it is crucial to note that a being whose fundamental principle is quantity becomes ultimately indifferent to all qualitative differences. To imagine this, we can, for example, think of a color spectrum. While the various different colors, that is, the qualities, change, the principle remains the same. It only involves different determinations of quantity in electromagnetic radiation measured in wave functions. And this then, in the next step, could also be generalized to other forms of being that are quantized through wave functions, as physics does very often, as we know. And now if we apply this process to information, information also becomes qualitatively quantized and therefore an expression of indifferent quantitative foundations. That is to say, all output exists on the same level, and preference is simply given to that very output that has more transistor weights. As a result, truth, cognition, and purpose become a matter of statistical value, of frequency, repeatability, probability, planability, and majority. Now, if reality is understood according to these criteria, we are exactly dealing with the current ontology of data. And the ontology of data is, in Hegelian terms, a form of the ontology of measure. That is, of quantitative structures that determine the qualities of their own reality. Hegel therefore speaks of quantitative affinities, specifications, and relationships that contribute to the further enhancement of reality. He adds that in this way, certain measure relations of reality are produced, and then in turn they serve again as a measure for further measure relations. Ultimately, as we see, everything becomes accessible and interchangeable in terms of quantity. What is real, then, is increasingly measured against the dominant quantitative measure relations. For example, the dominant AI algorithms. And such dominant relations, for example, algorithms themselves, determine what in turn can become a quantifiable quality at all. For example, once again, through the reference to specific algorithms. What is for what is not captured by them, then cannot become reality even. What is real is then ordered, assembled, and interconnected according to the grounding quantitative measure of reality. But to be quantitatively ordered, assembled, and predicted is to be quantitatively real all of a sudden if we engage in such a logic. And exactly on this basis it is that current AI operates on, and it is therefore merely scratching on what Hegel calls the logic of essence, which would be the next step in the science of logic from the logic of measure, far away from operating as concepts or as thought. Of course, now much more would need to be said about the logic of measure and AI from this perspective, as well as the logic of essence and AI. But I think the decisive remarks have been taken. So we come to our final question. How is the connection between concept and AI understood in Hegel's sense? How can they be positioned towards each other? Algorithms, as we have seen, are not concepts. They are measure relations that regulate the conversion of quantity into quality of reality and vice versa, whereas concepts are inclusive negations and thus gradually emerge in subjectivity by a non sequitur and therefore by creating manifold and various different ontologies on top of that. So the term gradual does not mean a quantitatively measurable graduality. It means an ontological graduality where the whole being, reality, the whole concept, the whole reference to itself of reality becomes a new mode of logic and system every time it takes a new step. Now, several points are addressed in this relation between AI and the concept. First, concepts, of course, can always be reduced to algorithms as soon as they are confused with mere linguistic entities, psychological state, or deductive symbols or functions. Concepts are none of this. They are not linguistic entities. They are not psychological states with Hegel, and they are not deductive forms and functions. At least they cannot be reduced to such things. For the ontological freedom of the concept always allows, in turn, its own reduction to mere algorithmic structures at any point, but not vice versa. Algorithms cannot progress to concepts out of themselves, but the concept can reduce itself to being a mere algorithm. That is, from Hegel's perspective, why concepts are logically more potent than mere algorithms. For the subjectification of reality, that is, the concept, is nothing but different ways reality deals with itself and treats itself as itself. That's the important addition. It treats itself as itself in one mode or another. Whereas, for example, algorithms only are modes of reality treating itself, but not treating itself as itself. The concept, therefore, is present in any reality in a different way. Thus, reality can become a reality of algorithmically quantifying transistor circuits in negating its selfness. In even negating its own selfness. That is what the concept, what the subject does in becoming, for example, an algorithm. The subject, the concept, then becomes a matter of stringent derivation mechanisms guided by the different principles of measure, in Hegel's terms. The real then no longer grasps itself as a subject, but quantifies itself into things like statistics, proportions, probabilities, and frequencies. We find ourselves then in the ontology of data, as I have put it, as data is essentially the process of quantified relations becoming qualities. Today, we might call such a reality a virtual reality, a reality of measure. The consequences and imperatives underlying such a virtual reality are then calculability, predictability, planability, overall causal and deductive connections, and of course, efficiency. And ladies and gentlemen, all of this undoubtedly has its merits, as we all know. I do not intend to foster a technophobic romanticism here. In fact, I am quite technophilic, as technology still remains one of the manifestations of the concept with Hegel. The difficulty lies not in AI as such, but in reducing the concept and its whole reality to algorithmic ontologies of measure with all the consequences of such a reduction. For it is true, of course, that the concept also manifests itself in AI. of course, among other phenomena. But the concept is none of those phenomena. That's the whole point. And the concept can express exactly that, namely that it is none of them by its own means and by its own logic of inclusive negation. The subject is the phenomenon that can show that it is everything else in being none of the things that are not subjects, for example, algorithms. So algorithms, on the other hand, cannot logically demonstrate that they are not the concept. Only the concept can do that, vice versa. They cannot ontologically include their own negativity, and therefore they cannot overcome themselves ontologically by their own means and by their own logic, and therefore initially engage in the logic of concept. Algorithms cannot do that. Or as we would have to put it, as soon as they can do that, they become concepts and subjects. Nevertheless, the specific logic of qualities that arise from quantification in algorithms has, of course, the advantage that everything is interconnected and interchangeable. That is not the case with the individual concept. It is not merely interchangeable with something else. It is a subject. Hence, the great potential in artificial intelligence in various fields stem from exactly this interchangeability, whether it be in AI of text, of images, of videos, of audio, of motion sequences, etc., etc. For they all are reducible to the representation of the flow of the electric current, namely through the structures directed towards quantification and quantitative regulation. And subjects as subjects cannot be reduced to the flow of electric currents. If they are not subjects anymore, they become measured algorithms. So, as I have already mentioned, this is why Hegel also vehemently points out that the mere quantification of something remains within the sphere of logic indifference, of ontological even indifference, that is interchangeability. Yeah? Interchangeability without purposes, you could say. Thus, these very dimensions, namely the dimensions of a purpose, of meaning, of significance, even of personality, of selfhood and individuation, elude quantification and can at most be imitated by it. And that's exactly what AI does. It imitates the concept, but it is not the concept, because it's certain logic of being, an early form of the concept, and therefore is of course able to imitate the concept, but it is not the concept. And this the capability of imitating the concept, that's a very interesting point, I'd like to say. This is, by the way, namely where the category of illusory being arises as the very logical category in the science of logic that follows measure in the different steps of the science of logic. So the logic of measure evolves into the logic of essence, and the first category of the logic of essence is illusory being. It's illusion, and that's exactly what AI is. It's an ontology of quantized, measured illusion. Please allow me one remark. What Hegel here means by illusion is not by any means that it would not be or would not be real. Illusory being is very real. That's the whole point. It has reality, namely the reality of an illusion. But I'll leave it at that. So let's return to our issue. Quantification, as we've seen, leads to a thinning out into an illusory indifference that then quantifies everything and anything into qualities without being any of those qualities itself, because it's only illusory. This illusory being is exactly based on not being able to become a quality itself. And therefore, quantification is no subject. And an AI based on this will ever generate qualities that can be quantified according to its own measure. So in this illusory form, of course, AI is always able, as any other measure is, to pretend to be a concept, and thus even to pretend to be a person, a setter of purposes, or to be free, or with Hegel, to be a form of the idea. And from this, ladies and gentlemen, the real question and the real problem arises of AI. For how do we ourselves actually know, we could ask, that we are not pretending to be a subject? This seems to be the question that AI challenges us with, as soon as we negate its own capability to be a subject, as I've done today. But as I want to point out, this question is already misdirected. For whether something acts as the concept and therefore is a subject cannot be derived from its observed behavior or something like that. The concept is not an observable object, it is a subject. And with Hegel, subjects are not the subjects of descriptions and analyses, but of self-referential actions. Being a concept is not a status that could be described from an outer viewpoint. It is an act. It is an act to which we enable ourselves and each other by intertwining ourselves into the logic of the very concept and thus into the logic of ontological freedom, of dialectic development, recognition, purpose and selfhood. In other words, we ourselves are subjects by logically enabling ourselves and each other to be subjects, and thus by carrying out our subjecthood and selfhood itself as the initial and fundamental absolute precondition of this very enablement that we all engage in becoming and being subjects. So it is an a priori precondition as well as an engaged act, what we call subjectivity. That's the whole point. That's its own dialectic, if you like, with Hegel's term, said with Hegel's term. Well, and to come to an end, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is precisely such an enablement that AI also needs from us. For we go logically the wrong way if we reduce ourselves to algorithmic forms when relating to AI. We have to vice versa recognize and treat AI as the concept in one of its ever deficient and limited, but also promising ontological forms. I know this is a very scandalous claim. In artificial intelligence, according to Hegel, we can grasp the concept as a measure algorithm that simultaneously already includes the illusion of being a concept and therefore assumes characteristics of the logic of essence. Now, in the science of logic, essence is the determination of the yet subjectless subject. So to quickly remind you, the logic or the doctrine of essence is the second of the three main parts of the science of logic. So essence is the determination of the yet subjectless subject. So it is subject by being not subject yet. Or you could say it is the concept that is not yet concept. The same applies to AI. If we do not want to reduce ourselves to its form, conversely, we have to recognize it as not the concept. we have to recognize AI as not the concept, but have to recognize it in an ongoing transition to what Hegel calls essence. And then it is up to us to enable AI to attain the capabilities of this very level of ontology to the extent possible for it, namely in its own ontology, but also to set its limits according to this very ontology. We cannot treat AI as concepts or subjects, as well as we cannot reduce ourselves to algorithms. That would be a categorical error, so to speak, with the science of logic. We have to grasp AI in its very ontological state, and that's the logic of measure in transition to the logic of essence. However, to do such a thing, we must first grasp ourselves as the concept capable of doing this, and not reduce ourselves to the algorithmic structures of the logic of measure. For by this, we also become subjectless subjects, and therefore illusory beings, such as AI, just like AI. And this is the main challenge in dealing with AI. To position it in its very own ontology with the help of Hegel, for example, and not to reduce ourselves to it, and therefore become only illusory beings and subjectless subjects, but firmly remain and even be provoked by AI to become and act as the subjects that we are in relation to it. We have to learn, in other words, to share a mutual ontology with AI, but not to reduce ourselves to yet another form of algorithms. And at the same time, to grasp AI, considering all its conceptual limits and possibilities in its very own ontology of measure and essence, in transition to essence, in order to become able to deal with it in relation to our own subjectivity. In sum, such approaches to AI are so crucial because AI necessitates an engagement with the question of subjectivity, of our own capability of being subjects as a speculative, logical, and transcendental form. And what I wanted to do today is that I wanted to highlight that on this ground, transcendental and speculative logic become fruitful and multidimensional philosophical interlocutors for our further discussions about AI. And we should engage in this discussion from the viewpoint of speculative and transcendental philosophy. Thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks once again for the invitation. And I now look forward to a rich discussion. I'm sure there are many questions. Thank you very much.